Welcome back to Ray's Talk Show, the podcast that won't be silenced. Thank you so much for joining us. This is your host, Ray Collazo. You can check out Ray's Talk Show anywhere you can download a podcast: iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you can download a podcast. Continue the conversation on Twitter at Ray's Podcast or Instagram at Ray's Latino Talk. Thank you so much for joining us on this somewhat somber edition of Ray's Talk Show. Natasha Lycia Ora Bannan from Latino Justice will join us to discuss the man-made tragedies being inflicted on Latinos by our federal government, to the residents of Puerto Rico and to the families on our southern border. We'll also share some thoughts on the legacy of legendary Latino advocate Angelo Falcon. We'll have our legislative and election updates. And on a lighter note, our Philly hip-hop philosopher Mario Collazo, a.k.a. Planetary, will catch us up on the latest hip-hop beef between Drake and Pusha T. All of this plus a few thoughts on Rosie rightfully catching an L. Let's now listen to Natasha Lycia Ora Bannan on Ray's Talk Show. Welcome back to Ray's Talk Show. Natasha Lycia Ora Bannan is a human rights lawyer that defends the rights of immigrants and the people of Puerto Rico, amongst others, in her work nationally and international. Natasha is both the Associate Legal Counsel at Latino Justice PRLDEF, as well as the president of the National Lawyers Guild, the nation's largest progressive bar association. Natasha, welcome to Ray's Talk Show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
You know, I wanted to bounce around some because of your work. Your work in totality is really at the intersection of the issues we're most concerned about this week. Let's start with Puerto Rico. First, Harvard comes out with a study days ago that documents what our activist network was already painfully aware of, that the death toll on the island directly related to the federal government's response to Hurricane Maria is at least 4,645 lost Puerto Ricans. To put that number in perspective, that's roughly the amount of people that we lost due to Hurricane Katrina and 9/11 combined. Natasha, how does this updated documentation of the death toll, due largely to federal government negligence, impact our ongoing response to the hurricane?
Well, I wonder first what the ongoing response is. I mean, the Army Corps of Engineers has said that they're leaving the island. FEMA, has transitioned on. I mean, the Trump administration expressed a long time ago that he felt that the federal presence needed to withdraw from the island. And I don't think that there's anything surprising about the study for those that were well aware and had publicly cried out that people were dying and that this is an issue about saving lives and not politics and not the politicization of those lives. It's still sobering to see those numbers, which isn't, an official estimate. It's an estimate because the government of Puerto Rico refused to collaborate in the study and didn't turn over any official data to the extent they have any, to the extent that their Institute for Forensic Science actually went out and was able to go out and try to document deaths. I think that's also very telling of their complicity in this. This isn't just the negligence of the federal government. This is criminal negligence, gross negligence at all levels of government. We're not talking about thousands of deaths as a result of a natural or unnatural phenomenon. We're talking about thousands of people who died as a result of government misconduct, as a result of government negligence, the omission of their acts. We heard all of the stories of how, FEMA was centralizing aid and making it impossible for mayors and for advocates and for families in the center of the island or anywhere outside of San Juan to access it. That they explicitly told their employees that they could not deliver food and water. That in the government of Puerto Rico, the governor's centralized location for aid, that aid was not leaving there, and that it became the job of municipalities like San Juan to try to ensure the aid was reaching other fellow towns, and that it was really largely a civilian-led effort led by the diaspora to make sure that family members are receiving essential services and essential needs needs like food, like healthcare, like solar-operated batteries and fans and generators to make sure that their health equipment was still running. This was the politicization of people's lives by local government. And I mean local, the government, the governor of Puerto Rico, as well as some municipalities that only distributed aid according to partisan affiliation, and would let people die as a result of that. Or when the governor of Puerto Rico, told Trump and media that the federal government was responding fully to all of his requests, and that the federal government had complied with everything that they had requested that they needed, which led the rest of us to ask, well, what exactly have you been asking for? Because it's weightfully low than what's actually needed on this island, and the fact that he was more interested in pandering to Trump and to the White House for his own political aspirations and that of his party, instead of tending to the very real needs of what we know now are thousands of people who were dying and who died as a result of gross negligence. And this is, it's sobering. It gives people a chance to finally, hopefully, properly remember their loved ones who both died on the island and outside of the island seeking medical attention and assistance. And it shows also what it means to live in a colony where your life is less than.
Natasha, before we get into how we move forward, I had a question for you as one of our top legal advocates in this area. Do Puerto Ricans have a legal recourse to this obvious government neglect?
That's a good and complicated question, because you would have to look and see, what was government's obligation, which branch of government, which agency, did they comply with it, did they implement and administer their duties in accordance with whatever authority they're governed by in a non-discriminatory fashion, in a way that isn't arbitrary and capricious. And unfortunately, and somewhat fortunately, in this case, unfortunately, a lot of government agencies are given wide discretion to assert their mandates. And it can be challenging to try to point out the deep flaws in their planning and the implementation of that plan. I mean, we all know the disaster that FEMA was, an agency responsible for responding to emergencies and facilitating aid became the primary obstacle in accessing that aid. It was FEMA that was making it impossible in so many ways for people to survive, to actually live. And even with that, it can still be really difficult to overcome a lot of the discretion that the law grants some of these agencies in carrying out, fulfilling their duties.
Well, we have, moving forward, we have many fronts to the Puerto Rican advocacy battle. The Promesa Board, the ongoing humanitarian crisis, which has not dissipated. We still have people that saw David Beñat's, latest report on CBS that, there's literally people sleeping outside because it's too hot and they still don't have electricity after 8 months. These are people with serious medical conditions. It's a miracle they're still alive, some of these folks. The displaced community scattered across the diaspora, the status question. Natasha, from your perspective, how do you think how do we prioritize advocacy for the nation of Puerto Rico at this point?
I mean, I think it has to all go together. I think that's been one of our challenges before, is that it's been very piecemeal. And what Hurricane Maria and the economic crisis have given us, in a way, is the chance to talk about how complex it is to live in a colony and what that means, and that it isn't just looking at the issue of voting, which is really minor compared with some of the deep structural inequalities that exist. And I don't say that to diminish the historic struggle that has led to people securing the right to vote. I say that to say that political rights in a colony cannot be reduced to voting. That it has to be about a process of full decolonization. When we talk about the economic crisis, the origin of that is a political crisis. And Hurricane Maria, isn't just a humanitarian crisis. It unsurfaced, like all crises do, the deep underlying structural inequalities that existed prior to that. I mean, the reason that people went 8, 9, 10 months without electricity is because of a crippled, failed infrastructure that was servicing debt to Wall Street and unable to adequately remedy and address itself and to be able to build a sustainable model of energy, of developing energy sources on an island, right? The deep austerity that's been imposed by this anti-democratic colonial fiscal control board that meant the closure of hundreds of schools that served as refugee spaces and shelters in disasters like a hurricane, which meant that there were less shelters available for people to go to, right? The inability to deal with all of the disrupted roads and highways. We know that most of the collection of debris and removal of it was citizen-led. It wasn't government-led. There are no resources to be able to help people restore access back to transportation and to be able to leave their communities and reach supermarkets where they could get food and water. That was all citizen-driven, and that's a result of the economic crisis and deep austerity that's been imposed. Wall Street vulture funds continue to demand billions of dollars of debt repayment, while we see the people of Puerto Rico suffering from decreased essential public services, closure of public schools, privatization of public schools, cuts to almost half of the budget of public higher ed institution. The University of Puerto Rico, the largest public education university system in the Caribbean, cuts to healthcare in a population that's increasingly aging, and cuts to education, which are all of these policies are driving the forced migration and displacement, which are being replaced by policies that incentivize literally bankers to come and to take up, shelter and space in Puerto Rico, and that has the effect of restructuring a society. You have forced migration and displacement coupled with land grabs, with the disaster capitalist model that pushes through neoliberal policies that prioritize private sector interests while taking that funding away from the public sector to fund it. And you have an extremely impoverished population that before the hurricane, 50% was living at the federal poverty level. Post-hurricane, who knows what that looks like now? I mean, all of this is really the existential crisis of a nation, and it has to be dealt with in its totality. It cannot be dealt with piecemeal. The international community cannot just express deep sympathy and pity. It has to express moral outrage. It has to demand a decolonization response, and U.S. citizens whose government continue to hold the colony in the 21st century in their name have to demand further government action that puts autonomous decision making, whether it's over the economy, over agriculture and food sovereignty, over the lives of Puerto Ricans, in the hands of the Puerto Rican people.
We will hear from Natasha again in a moment on the latest attack to our community taking place on our southern border. But first, a quick word on Roseanne Barr's firing by ABC for her disgusting racist comments this week. Roseanne's an asshole, and that doesn't deserve a job. There's no other industry where you'd be able to get away with saying those sorts of things publicly, particularly. I mean, why do we have to explain this? And I think that's kind of my point. I ask that everyone understands the sensitivity in which I make this analogy. But I think many of us feel like we're living in a perpetual state of being, as Americans, metaphorically abused partners in this democracy, in this experiment. As victims, we're desperate for normalcy, while our attacker tries to conflate us pushing back on hate and violence and abuse with somehow their victimhood. There's nothing normal or healthy about this relationship. And even worse, recent studies suggest that many white Americans are okay with less democracy if that is tied to keeping people of color in their place. Trump is the big symptom of this, but the illness is that feeling in too many Americans, including a few people of color, that it's all okay or some sort of relative problem on both sides, that where the victim is somehow guilty in all of this as well. Progressives and woke people ain't perfect. By all means, we are not. Certainly the Democratic Party isn't. But we're being abused, like all of us ultimately. We just have our eyes open to this and are actively trying to escape the nightmare. Let's hear again from Natasha Lycia Ora Bannan again to discuss Where Are the Children? And you're listening to Natasha Lycia Ora Bannan from Latino Justice on Ray's Talk Show. Natasha wanted to switch gears for a moment and discuss Where Are the Children? It's been reported by the federal government. They've admitted to losing track of nearly 1,500 children that were placed under their care after arriving to the border as unaccompanied minors. Many of these children are fleeing very, very dangerous conditions primarily in Central America, with families now being formally separated under the Trump administration's new policies. Even more children may be subject to the separation, potentially abuse, potentially trafficked. Natasha, another man-made disaster, humanitarian crisis by our government at the expense of Latinos.
Absolutely, and I think there was such moral outrage, mine included, at seeing these stories breaking, asking where the children of 1,500 migrant children. It was a little misleading because, in fact, the government basically said, well, we tried to reach them and nobody answered. Well, that's true for a number of reasons, and I think the richer, more complex story is that, why is it that people are afraid to answer calls from the Department of Health and Human Services inquiring as to the status and well-being of migrant children placed in their care? Because there's a tremendous fear of all government right now. This isn't even ICE, right? This isn't Immigration and Customs officials. This isn't the Department of Homeland Security. This is the Department of Health and Human Services checking up, and yet the fear of the immigrant community, of any government official, regardless of the level of government, that's including state and local officials, because of what we know to be policies that are encouraging collaboration and are fining municipalities and state governments for not colluding with ICE in targeting, detaining, and deporting immigrant families. The issue of separation, the fact that we have a formal policy that separates children from their families, is horrendous. It's violative of international law and principles. And to think back that 4 years ago, here we were as a country so consumed with the unaccompanied minor crisis that these children would risk their lives and that their parents would send their children unaccompanied to escape violence, primarily in the Northern Triangle countries, to embark on this extremely dangerous journey alone to reach our borders, and that recognized that we needed to provide them with legal assistance and representation, with housing, and there was a massive coordinated response. And that in 4 years, we have gone from that to defunding legal representation for unaccompanied minors, to separating children from their families, and to now calling these very same children who we recognized a few years ago as escaping gang violence, to calling them gang members, to equating them in their totality with criminals and with criminality and with gang violence and gang behaviors. I mean, it's insane to think that some of these children who literally have experienced death threats and are fleeing are now reaching our borders and being accused of being part of the very same institutions that they risked their lives to flee. And that they're being separated from their families at, par colmo, as we say, right? Like injury, insult on top of injury. This is just demonstrative of the inhumane and cruel immigration policies that we have that have absolutely nothing to do with national security, nothing to do with terrorism, and everything to do with racist and racial profiling immigration policies that target immigrants of color specifically in a way that other immigrant communities don't face. This is blatant government-sanctioned and government-sponsored racism, disguised, poorly disguised as immigration policy.
Natasha, from your perspective, and I know you're part of a network of legal activists that are doing everything you can to try to open up the doors of transparency here. But I mean, I feel like we just don't have nearly enough information that we need about what's happening to these families, what's happening to these children. I mean, there's literally small children being separated from their families. I mean, as we speak, and we've seen reports and pictures here and there about the conditions that these children were placed in, even during the Obama administration. But I mean, what from a legal perspective, what's the legal strategy of our advocates to just find out what's happening to these children, much less, and then try to begin to defend their human rights for legal and political representation?
I think part of the reason why we don't know what's happening to them is, one, we have a deep distrust of this government, and we don't trust them to actually have the interest of even migrant children at heart. And they don't know where they are, and yet they were the only ones that were in contact with them. So how is anyone else supposed to know where they are? Who is a child either placed in the care of a sponsor or in a detention facility going to call, especially when legal aid and funding for legal representation has been cut, which means that there are no lawyers going to visit them. There are no family members going to visit them. There are no advocates who can go to visit them to determine who's in these detention facilities, who's being placed in the care of sponsors. What are their needs? There is no access to information, and we know the conditions of some of these facilities for those that are being placed in either family detention or juvenile detention facilities, and we don't know who some of the sponsors are. I mean, this is the dilemma, is that we have decreased funding and decreased access for legal advocacy on behalf of essentially a community and a population that is voiceless before this government, and a deep distrust of government to actually have their interests at heart and to advocate in a way that secures even their basic necessities, right, as children. And it's presenting significant challenges in the legal and advocacy communities, and trying to think about how do we both stop the bleeding, the separation of families, which just re-traumatizes some of these children, and to get them legal representation, to get them back into the communities that they want to be a part of and keen to join without fear of being persecuted, targeted, criminalized, harassed, arrested, separated, detained, everything that is what immigration policy looks like these days.
Natasha, as we wrap up this conversation, there's probably people pulling off on the road, listening to this podcast, or jogging, or doing something else that are getting distracted and getting incensed by you laying out the realities of what's happening to our children, whether it's in Puerto Rico, the diaspora on the border, with our immigrant population. And not everyone is a lawyer or a legal advocate, but they all can be doing something. So just one or two things you suggest people that want to get more deeper engaged in these issues can do today to raise their voice for these children and members of our community.
Sure. Well, if you're a lawyer, obviously, all legal help is welcome. Safe Passage is an organization that has worked specifically with unaccompanied minors and providing them with legal representation. In Puerto Rico, we have an effort through the Maria Fund, mariafund.org, for people who want to donate directly to community-based organizations who both have who were born after the hurricane to respond to it, but also who have been doing work for a number of years before. And of course, LatinoJustice.org is a legal advocacy organization that's been defending the rights of Puerto Ricans in the Latino community for over 45 years, and we always welcome support in various ways. There's something that everyone can do, whether it's with your time, talent, resources, using your voice. We need you. Now.
Thank you, Natasha Lycia Ora Bannan of Latino Justice, for being on Ray's Talk Show. We look forward to having your passion and your expertise back on Ray's Talk Show very soon. Our election news this week is a call on our friends in Califas to make sure you vote in the upcoming elections in California on June 5th. A lot of sexy races on the ballot, and due to the peculiarities of election rules in California, many of the results Tuesday are going to end up pitting Democrats against each other in the general elections in November. There's a lot going on. The governor's race is very exciting, featuring the former mayors of San Francisco and Los Angeles, respectively, Gavin Newsom, Antonio Villaraigosa, and a guy who I have been keeping my eye on during this process, State Treasurer John Chiang. The Senate candidates feature longstanding Senate Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein versus upstart leader in the California Senate, Kevin De Leon, who's my favorite. Look forward to having Kevin make the runoff in November. And a slew of important House races. There's 7 California Republican members of Congress that have that Hillary Clinton won in their communities in 2016. So they're big national targets. Many of these districts have very high Latino populations. So whether you're in, even if you're not in a, if you're in Riverside, the Coachella Valley, the Inland Empire, Central California, you have a chance to really make history in June. So please go out to vote June 5th. Shout out to my homie, who's one of the candidates trying to replace Republican Ed Royce in CD 39, Sam Jamal. He's my favorite out there. So definitely look at Sam's candidacy. Get out to vote. And we will have on the show next week Adriana Maestas, who's going to come on the show, who's a California political journalist and analyst, who's going to come on the show to give us her analysis of the election results next week. So a lot of California talk here on Ray's Talk Show in the coming days. Our policy news comes from the states this week. A more Democratic-leaning Virginia state legislator just approved expanding Medicaid, which means thousands more people in Virginia will have health care. These state legislative races that we were so enthralled with in November matter, and some real policy gains are coming out of those election results, and particularly the rising electorate who really stepped it up out in Virginia. So much respect to our Virginia friends. And in Springfield, Illinois, lawmakers have voted to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, affirming equal rights for women and putting the legislation just one state away from potentially being adopted by the U.S. Constitution. So there's kind of an arcane rule that states that if 38 states ratify a particular law in their own state constitution, that they can bring it up essentially for ratification on the federal level. And so we're literally one state away from that happening. Virginia Democratic Congressman Don Bayer has called on the Virginia state legislature to follow suit and potentially force the hand of U.S. Congress to potentially ratify the Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Good things bubbling up in the states. That's why we have to continue to. Governor's races matter. State assembly and state senate races matter a whole lot. And a lot of good things continue to need to happen on the state level as we defend ourselves with all we have on the federal side. And now let's hear from Mario Collazo, planetary of the Outer Space and Army of the Pharaohs hip hop cruise, on the Drizzy Pusha T beef, and maybe a little conversation about burner accounts that are all the buzz in Philadelphia hoops. It doesn't seem like a week goes by without some big news in hip hop and also some big news in Philly sports that I always want to bring my hip hop philosopher on the line, my brother Mario Collazo, aka Planetary from Outer Space in the Army of the Pharaoh's crew. Mario, hip hop drama never ends, my friend. Even during Memorial Day weekend.
That's a good thing. Gotta keep the wheel spinning.
Got to
dry up.
Gotta keep hip hop alive. No doubt about it. So, and we are gonna ask Planet's opinion about the latest Philly sports drama, which dropped late in the wee hours last night. But before that, so if people didn't see it, really a pop superstar, Drake, and a longtime stable in the hip hop game, Pusha T, who I was a big fan of, especially back in his Clips days, went back and forth with some diss tracks over the weekend that had the whole hip hop social media world buzzing. I felt like I put on Facebook last night that I felt like I was cramming for a final exam, like trying to catch up on Twitter because it was dizzying. So, Mario, let people know what's going on with Drake and Pusha T.
Well, the beef with them has been going on for, gotta be over 5 years now, maybe 6, 7 years. They've been throwing subliminal shots here and there on verses, certain songs, and so, a little jab here, but I guess since Pusha just dropped his album, it was a good time to make it, for him to actually attack for real, in full attack mode. They started beefing back in the day. It was something with Lil Wayne, as the Wayne, I guess, since Drake was so committed to Wayne, because Wayne didn't put him on, that he felt a need to start getting into it, which I thought was a bad idea, but for him, because Pusha's just way too much for him, I think, as a lyricist. But it started from then, and then on, they just been, certain features, they throw a little jab here and a little jab there. And it was something that been brewing, and I think everybody kind of knew something was going to start happening, because they kept pushing the buttons a little harder every jab, So, but Pusha's been nasty, before you even heard of Drake, before Drake was even around. Quick lesson, you can find it on the internet, and Drake actually talks about it. Let me go backwards. If anybody remembers the movie 8 Mile, they saw the tactic that Eminem used in the movie, where he kind of did his own disses against them. So the guy in the movie that he was battling couldn't use those disses because Eminem already kind of dissed himself. So it was kind of a tactic to leave the other guy speechless. I don't know if you remember that 8 Mile.
Oh, I remember very well.
Yeah, he's like, I'm the white boy. He did all the things he could say. He said it against himself. And Drake did that in on his comeback to Infrared that Pusha did. What the hell was the Drake thing called? I already forgot. Since the new one, new stuff came out.
Duppy Freestyle. Duppy Freestyle.
Yeah. The Duppy Freestyle. But he talks about how he was such a fan of Pusha T in the Clips that he found on eBay, I think it was eBay, there was like a plastic microphone that was supposedly signed by Pusha T, and it cost $200, and he hunted it down to get the autograph, and he used to actually try to rap with it, and the signature rubbed off. He mentions that in the thing. He said the signature's faded. That's kind of where I feel we're at now, talking about like his reputation as a rapper. So he kind of used himself against him, because he knew that Pusha was going to use that. Like, you were just a fan chasing down my autographed microphone, And it turns out they don't even think it was an authentic autograph or whatever. But so that that was really what he had. So everybody thought Drake. Drake did a really good job with that W freestyle. I still like Infrared more though.
To compare and contrast them, my analysis in terms of like Duppy Freestyle, Drake's diss track on Pusha, is that it's really good. I mean, lyrically, and I think the flow and kind of how he approached it. but it's kind of like the surface level disses that are kind of common in hip hop beefs from my recollection as a fan. You know, like you're a fake. You know, he dissed Pusha T on like his drug dealing credentials. I like the line. You know, you act like you were with Escobar in the '80s. You know that you're kind of like below me. You know, you're kind of like a B-level hip hop artist where I'm a superstar, and the proxy Kanye stuff, which we'll get into in a second. But Pusha really went there to me on a deeper level, talking about Drake's family life growing up, his identity, his supposed child I wasn't aware of. Pusha like really went there.
Well, you know, to speak from an MC level who in high school was big into the battle, street battles. I mean, once there's really no limits. There's no ceiling to what you should be able to do. It's wartime. That's how it was looked at when you come from that. When you come from that culture, and he didn't go there until Drake went there first and said something about his fiance.
That's right.
So once you talk, I know me personally, you talking about life, I'm talking about everybody in your life. I don't care who it is. You know, I would have done it first, to be honest. But that's what you got to do. You can't take it personal. It's just rap, you know. If it hurts your feelings, and see, that's the thing. That's what I think it is about Drake. As much as Meek didn't do when it came to Drake, he created this hurt that Drake has. That perspective of Drake not being writing all his own stuff, that's never going to leave. And that's hurt. That hurt Drake. He even says it on the back-to-back disc to me. It weighs heavy on my conscience. He admitted that hurt on the song. Once he said that, I'm like, I kind of saw it. You can't admit you're hurt. You know what I mean? I thought that was a weird, I think he was just speaking with emotion on the Meek disc. And that's, no matter how bad he lost that battle, he kind of won in a way. Like not lyrically, but nobody's feelings were hurt more than Drake. And he admitted his feelings were hurt. And that stigma is never going to go away from him. There's always going to be a question, like there is now. Who's he going to have help him write this next one? This one's too hard. I wonder if somebody helped him write the back one. Even I personally think Drake's writing all this shit himself, but there's still that thought in the back of everybody's head, like this might not even be him though. You know what I mean?
Well, so yeah.
At the end of the day, we kind of killed him forever with that. Not in success, not musically or whatever, but internally.
Lyrical credibility.
It's hurt. He's hurt about it. He admitted to being hurt about it. And the fact that he responded so fast to Pusha T means he was pissed because of that one fact. You know what I mean? I don't think nothing else hurt him but that. That's why he went at Kanye. That was like the biggest thing. Well, how are you going to diss me for having a... And Kanye and Drake wrote for each other in the past. She said, how you don't respect me, but you respect Kanye? And I'm like, this has nothing to do with Kanye. So I looked at that as a kind of weakness. When you start to diss other people, when you're trying to diss one person, it just shows you don't have much because you're a fan of it. You don't have no dirt on it too much.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll see. I'm sure he's working at digging up as much as he possibly can right now to come back again. But, I don't know. As an MC, I look at it as like, Drake is the man and he's good at this. So you gotta, because I don't know if you remember, but Drake came at Common. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah.
So, I mean, that was a hard verse.
Well, I mean, Pusha T. By the way, do you think it? And people saw it going around. Do you think is that Drake in that blackface? That's another part of this, which is really interesting.
Well, here's the thing, right? People are upset about it. It's the blackface, but I'm gonna break it down on how Pusha did this. Pusha, he said if you watch the Breakfast Club interview, and they mentioned it. I don't know. Did you see that?
I haven't seen it yet. No, I saw Charlamagne commenting on this whole situation, saying this is like late '90s, early 2000s disrespectful stuff.
Yeah. When there's a get a second, there's an actual clip where it goes straight to the part I'm talking about. Charlamagne right away brings up Drake. And when y'all gonna go to war? When y'all gonna do this or whatever? And Pusha basically was like, what he did to me, that was alright. That was nice. It was cute. So he basically threw it out there like, dude ain't doing that shit to me. You know what I mean? Regardless of who he did that to, it ain't happening to me. So the thing is with Pusha on that interview, he said, what Drake did was cool, but what I do is art. When I write, it's not just like quick. Basically he's saying I don't just say talk to my emotions right away. I put it together the right way. This record, like most. You look at the whole concept of the story of Edison. Jay-Z, he rapped over the Jay-Z story of OJ. So the story of OJ, the story of Adidon. Now, if you remember the story of OJ videos, he used the old blackface thing from the, in the cartoon form that was basically like talking about how, OJ was an Uncle Tom and, all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And the story of Adidon, he used the blackface famous story of OJ. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So he used that whole concept and he made up. He did exactly what he said he would do. My shit is a piece of art. I'm gonna do this creatively. I'm not gonna do this like rapping over something real fast and not giving, not doing my research. That's why when people said, he's got to come back within 24 hours. I was getting upset at that concept. We never did that. That's never how it was. Why does it have to be so fast?
Yeah, and I mean the Jay-Z Nas. Remember the Jay-Z Nas beef was over like 2 years, and they would pick their spots.
Yeah, and Ether came out a long time after the takeover. With the Jay and Nas beef. So I'm like, you can respect Ether. Why does Pusha T got to do it today? Let him. You know what I mean? That's not how it works. But then I'm glad he didn't because somebody tweeted something that was real dope. They said, you can't let Drake dictate the pace, control the pace.
That's right.
And that's exactly, Pusha's doing everything right in my opinion. Like there's no way Drake was not somewhere super pissed off last night.
What do you think's the next step here? Pusha T's album, actually Kanye produced the whole thing, I think, and this is going to give, I think, more buzz to people paying attention to what Pusha's doing. I know he got a lot of play on that Nike commercial with all the athletes, and he was telling Aaron Rodgers, you need to listen to my stuff to get hype. So he's already got his place in pop culture. What do you think's the next step here for both Drake and Pusha T?
I mean, Drake's definitely in the next day or two going to come up with another. Because now Pusha's controlling the pace, which is what he should have done. So he's not going to rush something. He's like, shit, I gotta construct something creative because now this is gonna have a more popular than you think because nobody cares about that now. The only people that care about that are the girls, like the girl fans and the kids that don't really understand this part of the culture. You know what I mean? They don't care. Like no matter what you do or what you say, Drake can't lose to those part of his fans. But Drake is so good at what he does, people like me are still a fan of him. He's kind of sunk into every dynamic he has. Older people like him, street people like him, girls like him, kids like him. Like everybody likes Drake. But when it comes to this, when Pusha had put it together, they controlled it. Now it's like this is like a battle. Like this is hip hop now. It's strictly hip hop. It's nothing else.
Yeah, he says that, and then Kanye's producing all his stuff. The real quick on Philly sports, for people who didn't see it, Brian Colangelo, the general manager of our Philadelphia 76ers, The Ringer, a sports website, has reported that there is a lot of evidence to suggest that this general manager has up to as many as 5 Twitter burner accounts to basically monitor, troll, gossip, and try to move conversations with sports writers around players that are either on the Sixers or used to be on the Sixers, but most importantly, Joel Embiid, who's on the team. This is like pretty incredible. Do you believe this, Mario? I mean, this there's a lot of evidence pointing that Colangelo is trolling a lot on Twitter.
I mean, this whole thing with Colangelo, I don't want to believe it, to be honest. And I'm like, what the hell would you do this for? He got me for his, got me a good spot. The evidence is there, get rid of him. I say I want to Hinky back any damn way.
I know. Hinky's at a Starbucks in San Francisco now plotting his next move.
I don't like his face. I never really like his face anyway. I don't like the attitude. I don't know. Seems like he's not a nice dude. But
he's a little too slick.
I'm pretty judging, but I'm like, if he did this, I don't think there's a question. He's got to get him out of here. Because Angelo, I'm not trying to figure out what's going on. That's a really strange thing. But the evidence is there. I mean, I think he should be fired by tomorrow.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the thing is, we all ended up staying up in the wee hours because you're like looking at all Joel Embiid. I mean, the other guys aren't really. I mean, Fultz is kind of important, but who cares about the other guys aren't team anymore. But you're really worried about what Embiid's thinking about all this. You don't want him, and you don't want any stress. You don't want him. You want him feeling good about the organization, and he's sort of. Embiid's funny. I mean, he ultimately put this morning on Instagram that it was a crazy night, but I don't believe it ultimately. So he's playing the high road, but I mean, I believe it. So, or I'd be very skeptical as how it's him. So the bottom line is they're going to get answers quick because we can't have, the owners of the Sixers go on vacation with Joel Embiid. I mean, they know how much he means to this organization. And if Colangelo's, dropping medical information, this way and just being immature, then he's got to go. So yeah, the Sons of Sam.
The fact that even if somebody affiliated with him that was near him did it, you got to get rid of him.
That's right.
You can't disrespect. You can't disrespect your superstar.
That's right.
And other than and outside of that, we know what we got to do to get to the next level. You don't need Colangelo at this point to tell anybody what they got to do.
That's right.
So it's out there. We gotta get LeBron, or we gotta get PG Kawhi. We gotta get somebody.
That's right.
Do good in this, gotta do good in this trip.
And you gotta get Fultz to get it together. I mean, he showed some signs. He'll grow up. He'll be okay.
Get him the hell out of here either way.
And finally tonight, a few words of appreciation for Angelo Falcon. Angelo was a legendary Latino advocate and political scientist that unfortunately passed away last week in New York City. It's just particularly unfortunate because we had one of the great labor leaders in our community, Lucia Gomez from Labor's International out of New York City, Local 78. We recorded an interview with Lucia to discuss this. She was a longtime colleague, and Angelo was a longtime mentor of hers in her career. But we had technical issues, and the audio, unfortunately, just isn't playable for the show. But I did want to share, but Lucia, in that conversation that I had with her earlier this week, did share, I think the most important thing I wanted to share about Angelo was, we know about his, people that have realized, his work to push New York politicians, the Latino leadership class in New York City, and really Latinos all over the country as it relates to pushing for the agenda of Latinos, Puerto Ricans, and the traditionally voiceless in our society. But at his heart, Angelo was a mentor. And Lucia very eloquently spoke about that in the interview I had with her earlier this week about how basically she wouldn't be, for my money, one of the top Latino organizers, political organizers in the country if it wasn't for Angelo and his mentorship over the years of their working relationship. And that's I feel the exact same way. My relationship with Angelo began when, as a college student, who literally called his office at like 10 o'clock at night thinking, well, I want to have time in the morning and I want to connect with him at some point. And he's a busy guy. So let me leave a voicemail message and maybe in the next couple of weeks, I'll hear back from him. He literally picked up the phone and explained to me that he was a night owl. He liked to work in his office in sort of odd times. He was sort of an odd guy, Angelo. He was one of a kind. And we probably spoke for an hour that night just about being Puerto Rican males doing this sort of work, advocacy at the time. Police issues were very prominent in the 90s, and that was some of the work I was doing as a college activist. We just spoke, and we became colleagues and friends, and he was a great mentor of mine for the last 25 years before his passing last week. A true son of Brooklyn, great Brooklyn Rican, and just a wonderful man. And the incredible thing about Angelo is he, from a historical perspective, really was such a pioneer. He really was sort of a voice in the wilderness for New York Latino, sort of independent New York Latino advocacy, outside of Democratic Party politics and some labor circles. There really just isn't much capacity, even to this day, for Latinos to sort of have their own lane of advocacy that really focuses on the Latino community sort of without these other political strings. And Angelo was really one of the first leaders on a national level and even amongst the Puerto Rican community to really discuss the Puerto Rican diaspora in sort of political terms. And he was talking about our community in the New England states, in the Mid-Atlantic states, and in Florida, in Ohio, in the Midwest, and throughout the country before it was fashionable. And really was a great beacon of a voice to infuse the Puerto Rican and sort of East Coast Latino perspective in national Latino leadership circles and conversations. One of a kind, a wonderful man, and Angelo Falcon will truly be missed. Rest in power, Angelo. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of Ray's Talk Show. Again, you can continue the conversation on social media, on Twitter @Ray's Podcast, Instagram @Ray's Latino Talk. Email me, podcastrays@gmail.com. That's podcastrays@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing your feedback, your conversation. Let us know what you'd like to hear about. And we want to continue the conversations about how we mobilize as a community, because Ray's Talk Show and our community here is a podcast in a community that won't be silenced. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend.